All right, we will get started. Let's start with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into class. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many blessings you give us, and we thank you for the freedom and opportunity we have to come and study your word and to learn more about you, Lord. I just ask that you bless us as we continue to study your life and your ministry and the things that you did during that ministry, and how you worked with people and treated people and showed people who you were and your light, Lord. And I just ask that we learn from that and take that same example out into the world and use it to bring others to you. And it's in Christ we pray. Amen. All right, so I was looking at this past week, and I think we're a little over halfway through, and this is lesson 20 or 21. So I don't know if we'll have 20 more weeks, because some of the things that we went through early on took a little bit longer to go through. A lot of these are a little like getting into shorter and shorter stories before we get to the end. But we'll see. Next week we're going to talk about the lost sheep. We might spend a little bit more time on that one, because that's a significant story. Oh, gentlemen, can I have one of those sheets? I always do that. I hand them out and forget to save myself one. I got my notes up here, but I just like looking at the paper sometimes. So the first one we're gonna start off with today is Peter finds the coin in the fish's mouth. Who's in here is very familiar with this story, with this part of the Bible? I'm gonna be honest. I recall it, and I remember little bits of it, and I remember hearing it, but I've never really studied it much. And it's kind of interesting. One of the things the second note you'll see here, only Matthew records this. And most scholars believe the only reason that Matthew recorded it is because Matthew is talking about collecting taxes and a tax collector. And Matthew being a tax collector, this would have resonated with him. So this is more than likely why he wrote this particular piece in Matthew. So this is in Matthew 17, verses 24 through 27. We'll read this real quick. On their arrival in Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," Peter replied. Then he went into the house. Now, this was something that Peter just really said something he didn't know he was talking about a little bit, and we're going to look at that a little bit. He just kind of, they asked him, and it was like, yeah, he does, and he walks on in, but we'll look at that a little bit. But before he had a chance to speak, Jesus asked him, "What do you think, Peter? Do kings tax their own people or their people they have conquered?" "They tax the people they have conquered," Peter replied. "Well then," Jesus said, "the citizens are free. However, we don't want to offend them, so go down to the lake and throw in a line. Open the mouth of the fish, first fish you catch, and you will find a large silver coin. Take it and pay the tax for both of us." Now, it doesn't say, we assume that he went down and did this. Does it really? Huh. I'll have to go back and look at I didn't look at the difference between the New American Standard and this. What version do you have? New American Standard? Okay. Okay. I'll go back and look and find out. We can look at that. I'll find out why they translated that a little bit differently, and see if there's a reason why they did that. I didn't really look at the differences between these two. Yep.
That was imposed way back in the Old Covenant that they were still under, and so it was a Jewish thing. And as my understanding, every male Jew had to pay that, right, by a certain age?
Yeah, it was.
I guess whenever they started having an income or whatever.
Yeah, I can't remember what the actual age is.
20 years and older.
Was it 20 years?
And older.
Okay. Yeah, let me. What I'll do, Steve. Let me do a little bit of research on it. We'll find out. Usually, I'll go back and forth. But that isn't interesting because I'm looking at even the newer version. So there's a 2020 version of the New American Standard where they've kind of updated some language, the language side, and it says. It says sons or from their sons or from their strangers, and there's a footnote there, or tax on each person in the census. And so maybe, maybe since part of that they're talking about this. No. But I like stuff like that. I like to dive into it. So I'll look into that. We will look and see what's that. But anyway, so, all Jewish males had to pay the temple tax. Yes, it was 20. Like Steve said, and you can read Exodus 30:11 through 16 if you want to kind of get where they pull that from and why that was. And so they would set up the booths to collect taxes for the most part. Matthew, from what I understand, didn't collect the temple tax. He was a tax collector for the Roman government, so which made him even worse than these guys. This one was understandable, part of their religion. What Matthew did was basically he was considered a traitor. So, the note here, Peter actually answered this question without really knowing the answer, what he was saying. He what's Peter known for? Peter's known for being just quick to shoot off the hip, right? We look at a lot of the things that he did. A couple weeks ago, he was basically getting in the way of Jesus trying to. Continue his ministry, talking about him dying on the cross. So Peter likes to just talk without thinking sometimes. I think we all can relate to that. So he puts Jesus and the disciples in an awkward position. And so Jesus takes this situation to emphasize his kingly role of who he is. Because still there's this conflict going back and forth, a misunderstanding of what kingdom, of what his ministry or his kingdom's going to look like. They're still kind of expecting this earthly kingdom that he's going to come in and establish a throne there. And so he's still trying to use that, but also, he says, he's basically saying, I'm the king. I don't pay taxes, right? And we don't, and the kings don't collect from their family. So he's making the point that, hey, look, does the king pay taxes or does the king's family pay taxes? Obviously the answer is no to that. And he's talking about the kingdom. But then he says in verse 27, however, we don't want to offend them, so go down to the lake and throw in a line. Right? And he says, we don't want to offend them. So basically, I'm going to provide what you need to give for this tax collection, for this temple tax. And so it's an interesting dynamic, and I think it makes a point for us too, and I put these in here. One, Jesus supplied the tax payment for both him and Peter, rather than offend those who didn't understand his kingship. It's interesting that of all the times that Jesus wasn't afraid to offend, or upset the Pharisees or the people of the religious world, this is one particular time where he said, you know what, let's play into this. Now, part of my thought on this was, is it because they're still under the old law? And if you look back in Exodus, it's part of the law.
Break the law, but
fulfill it, right?
And if he broke the law, that does give them something to really keep hammering on.
Yeah, and so that.
Probably had bigger fish to fry.
And that's my thing. I think part of it is, one, he didn't want to break the law that we have here in Exodus. And then he didn't want to give them more ammunition than what they already had against him for what they were claiming. And then two, like Dad said, he had bigger things to worry about. So, another thing too is, although Jesus supplied the money, Peter still had to go get it. All right, and I think that speaks to us today. God blesses us, but we still have to work for it. Right? We don't just, there's things where God, I'll say there's things we don't earn or whatever, but in the end, I think God still expects us in a way to work for what he's going to give us. It's not just us sitting here and God's just going to bless us because we're here. And so I think that's a point. And then lastly, ultimately, all that we have comes to us from God's supply, but he may want us to be active in the process.
Chad, Jesus is always trying to help his disciples have more faith. And I think this is one of those where Jesus still have enough in there. So Peter had to have enough faith to actually do what it said to do, even if it sounded a little wild.
Yeah.
You know?
Anyone in here ever been fishing and caught fish and had a coin in its mouth? I've caught fish with lures in their mouth, or frogs or other fish in their mouth, but never a coin. That'd be interesting. And then the last point of this, as God's people, we are foreigners, and I think this is part of the point he's trying to get to as well, is we're foreigners on earth. All right, our loyalty is to Jesus and in His kingdom, but we're still ambassadors for Christ here on earth. And so, when we see this a little bit more, I think I put, is it 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians 5:20 in here? As ambassadors to other countries, you still have to keep that country's law. Right? And so as Christians, we live in this earth, we have to keep the earthly laws. Now, there is a limit to that. If the laws have us break the laws of our kingdom, right? Then we have to. There's a fine line where, or there's not a fine line. There's a solid line where we have to stop.
In the missionary field, when you go into foreign countries, you have to abide by their laws.
Yep.
Do what they say.
Yeah. And to be honest, some of that spreading the message in some countries is breaking the law, right? But obviously, this God's law, what Jesus commanded to do, trumps what a government says, but there are still, you don't just go in there and blatantly just break all their laws. Yep.
Fairs, whatever they have to do.
Yep. And so we have, as citizens, and I think this speaks volume, and I think, because I think if we say, well, you know what, I'm a son of God, I'm a son of Jesus, or however you want to word that, and I'm going to do what I want because I have freedom and I can do this. I'm going to follow these laws and that's it. Well, then we lose credibility. Because if you act like a rear end and people see that, they're like, well, that's not very Christian-like. Or that's not very... And so we need to make sure that we obey the laws of the land up to the point of it's not where we're having to sin. So I think this is important. I know sometimes I've seen from some churches and some organizations where it's, they're very, very anti-government, very I guess what you would say, establishment type stuff. And I don't think that's what Jesus called us here to do. And I think He talks to this here because He could have easily said, I don't have to pay your tax. I'm God. Do what I want. But he still obeyed the law. So I think there's a lesson in there with that as well. So 3 short verses, but I think there's a lot of points and a lot of lessons we can learn just from those verses. Any comments, questions on that? All right, the disciples argue about who's greatest. So this is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm going to read Mark's account because I like it a little bit better. I think it kind of gives a little bit more insight into how they were being. When you read this, if you want to read all 3 of them, you can. But if we start in Mark 9, verses 33. After they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked His disciples, what were you discussing out on the road? So they were walking and having this discussion. Obviously, Jesus knew what they were discussing, but He's wanting to bring this up about what they were discussing. And in verse 34, they didn't want to answer. He said, but they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which one of them was going to be the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to Him, and said, whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else. Then He put a little child among them. Taking the child in His arms, He said to them, anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and any who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me. So you can see here that they were kind of this is a human thing, right? When you get a group of, especially you get 12 guys together, right? And I think this is human. I'm just thinking from a man's standpoint. There's this competition, right? Who's going to be the greatest? Who's the best at this, right? You see this, and you get a bunch of little boys together, right? And what do they like to do, and what do they like to fight about, or the discussions they have? King of the Hill, right? You ever listen to two boys talk about which one's daddy can beat up the other daddy? And so this is their human nature coming out. Which one of us is going to be greatest in this kingdom? And this comes out a little bit more later on. But they were caught in their constant struggle for personal success, and they knew they were wrong in this because they didn't want to answer Jesus when he asked. And so it says here, it's always painful to compare our motives with Christ. It's not wrong for believers to be ambitious, but when ambition pushes aside obedience and service, it becomes a sin. All right, when you're looking to be the greatest in an organization or in the church or any of those type of things, it's not wrong to be ambitious about that, right? I mean, it's not ambitious to want to be an elder. It's not ambitious to want to be a deacon, right? It's if your ambition is, I want to be an elder so that way I have power over everyone, which if you understand the elder role, you know that's not the case, right? And so that's what he gets at here is, and that's why he. Go ahead.
Yeah, the reason he does that is like we always talked about. They're thinking physical, and he's thinking spiritual.
Spiritual, yep.
That's why he says you take one of these child and accept them, and you accept me and my Father. So he's trying to make them understand, but they still will. They still don't.
Yeah, they really don't get it until after his resurrection.
And the thing is, I'm not sure exactly how long they've been with Jesus in his ministry, but if they just watched him, he said he didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many, and that's the ultimate service. And I mean, he was constantly serving, and you would have thought they would have picked up on it. Here's the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who's laying down his life and expending his life for other people.
Yep. I think sometimes we can be very blind, human nature, to be blinded to things that's obvious right in front of you. You know, I mean, this was a very obvious, the way Jesus was not seeking power. And in any no way did he ever try and make it look like he was trying to seek power or gain power. But that human nature side of, we know the kingdom's coming and still got that idea. I wonder which one of us, I'm sure the discussion about who's going to sit on the left and right side comes up later. And so they still didn't get that. And so a little bit, we can be like the disciples and even like, see, the Pharisees thought this way. All right, the Pharisees, a lot of their thing was about power and control. Control of the people through the religious law. And so sometimes as Christians, we can get that way sometimes too. All right, go ahead.
I mean, they sought the cheap seats. They sat in the front of everybody. They sat at the front of the tables. They made sure that everybody saw them.
Yep.
They were very recognizable, very, look at me, where I'm at, and all that stuff. So, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, in Matthew, it talks about unless you become like children when you're converted.
Yeah.
What do children have? Children have this just absolute complete faith in things. I mean, they just believe.
Yeah.
That's it. They believe. They don't care about it. I believe. That's it. Period. And that's hard for adults to have.
Yeah, it is very hard.
Because things come into our lives and we shift it around.
We become skeptical, right? Children haven't had enough, I don't know, disappointment, pain, however you want to word it, I could tell them, hey, I could tell a little child, hey, guess what? I took and I jumped off the roof yesterday and I flew like a bird over to my house. And they'd be like, oh, that's awesome, Wow, I can't believe you did that. Now, if I go and tell, someone, an adult in here, they're going to be like, we might need to send him up to Greenleaf. There's something wrong with him, And so and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. And so we've got to make sure that our motives inside God's kingdom isn't to be the top-notch guy, isn't to be the most influential, it's to be the one who serves the most. I mean, that's what. Go ahead, Deb.
I think another dynamic here is these apostles know that these two positions in their situation would be unearned and undeserved.
Yeah.
Because the right and the left hand on a king, especially one that's going to, in their mind, overthrow the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, you don't have fishermen
I think so. And so, that last line says, we must renounce pride and status seeking. Those are Satan's tools and not Christ. I mean, what was one of the temptations that Satan tried to use with Christ? Look, I'll give you all this, right? You'll be in. And so that works. Obviously, that works. Or he wouldn't have tried it on Satan or on Jesus. Satan wouldn't have tried it on Jesus. So then Jesus transitions and he grabs a child to help his disciples who are thinking about themselves. And he says, we are not to be childish. Right? There's a difference between childlike and childish. Right? The disciples were being childish. Right? Children can be very selfish, right? A newborn baby is what?
They're totally selfish.
People are going to be like, oh, well, you can't say that about a newborn baby. What are newborn baby are what? They're selfish, right? If you could ask a newborn baby, what are they thinking about? Themselves, right? Food. Yes. All right. Now that may be like off, like Chad. You can't call a child selfish, but I mean that's not their intent. But a child, a baby, all they can think about is what for them, because that's they have to have that. Now that's being childish, right? Being childlike is what Steve talked about. They're having that faith and that that wonder. All right, being humble and being
you can teach them.
Mm-hmm.
They're open.
They're open. Yep.
They're receptive.
And that's one of the things. And this is just a personal. That's one of the things I've always. I don't know. And again, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. This is not what that. One of the things I've always challenged myself to try to do, and you might see this a little bit out in the foyer, is I always try to be a little bit childlike, playful. I try not to be childish. Sometimes that comes out. I think it comes out in all of us. But I always try to have that connection with the babies, the kids, and the stuff like one, because I think it keeps you a little humble. That children will keep you humble. They'll tell you the God's honest truth, right? Whether you want to hear it or not. And so I think that the other side of that is I always try to keep that open-mindedness, right? Obviously not just believe anything I'm told, but knowing enough and understanding enough to say, hey, I may not always be right here, or maybe let me relook at this. And I think that's part of the what he wants us to be in being in childlike as well is. Like he just said, is they're open to things. They're open, they're not just shut off. Us, we can get that way sometimes. Life experiences, tragedies, just life in general can make you hard. And so that's one of the things I work hard on, is to make sure that I don't become hard just because of what life's thrown at me sometimes. Now, I'll be 100% honest too. My life's been a lot easier than a lot of other people's lives. And so, I take that into account. But I think we've got to try to keep this attitude to continuously try to be childlike. The last point here is the disciples became so preoccupied with the organization of Jesus' earthly kingdom that they had lost sight of the divine purpose. And I'll be the first to admit that in a lot of my studies and a lot of things that I come across, I've been guilty of this, right? I kind of get into the idea of, well, we have to have this perfect structure and the church will grow, right? And that's not it helps. It helps. It's good to be structured well. But if you, in the end, it's about being faithful to Christ and doing his work. And if you're committed to Christ and doing his work, you can overcome maybe some of the what I would say is lacking of the physical or organizational structure things that's inside the church sometimes. Obviously, if you look, Jesus put an organizational structure in there for a reason. It helps it grow. It's needed, but it doesn't have to be perfect in order for the church to grow. And so I think this is one of those things that we can become hyper focused on sometimes. Not only that, but I know one of the things we're guilty of in the church is like we got super hyper focused on like how our worship service had to be, right? it had to be in this particular order, and if it wasn't in this particular order, then it wasn't right, you know? And so we get focused on things like that sometimes that they're important, right? How we worship God's important, but is it the thing we should be focusing on and really just splitting churches over, right?
Much on physical church, the real church, spiritual church.
Yeah, we miss the spiritual church.
God adds to that. We don't do that.
Yep.
And we don't practice what we preach.
Yeah, yeah.
We talk about, you know, we talk about the 5 acts of worship and how the Bible commands those, and you need to sing, and it tells us how to sing. And each song leader can tell you they get up here, and I'm not going to put a number on it, but a good many folk never sing. So,
Yep.
so what? I mean, why in the world argue about something you're not going to do anyway?
Well, you know, I don't have a lot of time. I was thinking about the because I've been doing I've been doing a deep study into baptism and just everything around it. And one of the things that bothers me is we have a very close, correct theology or working around baptism. And we complain a lot about other organizations that we say don't baptize correctly. But yet the other organizations who baptism isn't a big focus of theirs are baptizing 100 times more people than we are. And so I struggle with that when I'm studying. It's like, okay, we have this. It's important. It's very important. It's essential. But the people who think it's not essential are just blowing us out of the water when it comes to doing it. And so, what are we getting caught up on? Are we getting caught up in the physical act of baptism, or should we be getting caught up on the spiritual significance of what baptism is?
Amen. That's right.
And so, because if we connected with the physical importance and understanding of what baptism is, then we'd be trying to baptize and convert as many people as we possibly could. And so sometimes I think we get caught in this physical focus, this physical side of things, versus the spiritual, and it becomes a distraction.
Absolutely right.
And so, again, don't take away from that Chad doesn't think baptism is important. All right, I do. It's very important. It's a very essential piece of salvation. But what's our focus? Are we just trying to dunk people in water? And is that why we're not going out and converting people like we should be, or baptizing people like we should be? I think there's a lot around that. But anyways, that was one of the things I was thinking about as I was studying. But I'll move on.
Sometimes we try to enforce baptism on a convert when he's trying to convert. You know, like, you can't be, you know, we try to get legalistic with it.
I do think that, and me and Dad were having this conversation the other day. In our pursuit to get things right, which is a noble pursuit. I mean, we should try to be as 100% biblical as we can. But in our pursuit to do that, if a denomination was doing something, then we would go to the extreme opposite to make sure that we weren't any similar to that. Right? And I think in doing that, we became legalistic in things. It's like, you have to do this, but we don't truly, I mean, I'm telling you right now, me studying baptism and diving into it, I have a whole different understanding of what it really is versus what I thought it was. And that's just doing a lot. I mean, that's, you know, I've been studying, in the church, I say in the church 40 years. I mean, I'm 40 years old, right? And so I've been brought up, taught about it. But I don't know if anyone's, anyways, this is going to be my next class, is we're going to do a series just on baptism. We're going to dive deep into it. Because, sorry, I lost my train of thought. But back to that. Yeah, but I think we do get legalistic with things. It's like you just have to do it, but we don't really get deep into why they're doing it.
They should desire to do it.
Exactly.
That's why the Pharisees didn't see Jesus.
Yes.
They
And
knew the Messiah was coming.
yeah. And I try not to be too critical, but there are times where we become very Pharisaic and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, you just have to do it. You have to do it because, and I talked about this when we were talking about communion the other day, right? Our thing is we have to do it because that's what the New Testament church did.
And it's like killing a child
Because I said so, right? And so what I want us to get to, and what Jesus got to, is the heart. It was the heart of the matter. If someone's doing it just because, well, they did it, then that's not good. Right? Go ahead.
See, the end result of that is that we go through the motion, not just with baptism. We
Yeah.
can all the steps.
Yeah, we can- yeah.
Call it, all right, I'm gonna hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized, and then we go through those motions and do those things. And like we're talking about the heart or the understanding's not there. And okay, I did these things. Y'all said I needed to do them. I had to do them. I did these things. And then what's their life like going forward? See, are they truly converted to Christ, where they're going to become a disciple, where they're going to make Jesus their Lord, where they're going to obey Him because Jesus said, "If you love me, you obey my commandments." Are they just going to continue to go through the motions, and that pretty much be their Christian existence?
And that's
There's going to be a growing relationship with Jesus Christ.
And that's where I want us to my in everything that a lot of the teachings that I've been doing, and a lot of things I try to do it in a way that one makes you think, right, or might challenge you a little bit. And I know I get pushback from that. And I don't do it to cause pushback, but I want you to kind of to think about some of the things that we believe, right? Not because I don't think they're true, but why do you believe them? Do you truly understand why you believe? Do you truly understand what baptism really is? Because a lot of people in the church really thinks baptism is just kind of a dunking in the water. They're good. But they don't really understand everything that's why it's there. Go ahead.
That's why I've seen quite a few Christians later on in their lives go back and be rebaptized. I think they finally understood that they probably didn't understand it at the time, and they just want to make sure.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, just take, some of you have concordances in the back of the Bible. There's some Bible study tools, or just go do a Google search for verses, Bible verses around baptism. All right? And I'll give you an example. Like, this is just a parallel, right? There's things we believe. There's things we believe in a cappella music, right? So if I do a research, if I research a cappella music, for the most part, I can fill up about one page of information about a cappella music, right? And again, this isn't to say we should or should not be. No, I'm all for a cappella music. Study baptism, and I'm talking about just diving into biblical Bible verses and following the logic around it and the understanding around it, and it's about 50 pages.
If you add the pages that you have to peel away all the false beliefs,
Yeah.
it gets
Yeah.
even bigger.
Yeah. But I'm talking just true study of what baptism is in the Bible, why they did it, all the examples of baptism. And I know this is kind of getting off, but in a way it's not. Because I want us to make sure that we are not focusing on the physical parts of our what we call organization of the church, right? The church is to be a spiritual, 100% spiritual entity. But we've kind of sometimes made it physical, and more than others. I mean, there's some religious organizations who they have made the building itself holy, and things in the building holy. There's nothing holy about anything in here. Well, maybe the Bible. Let me. It says Holy Bible on the front of it, right?
And the ongoing struggle is that, as Paul says in Romans 7, we are physical.
We are,
And we're trying to be spiritual.
and so that's where that.
But we are in the flesh, and oftentimes that's what we out if we're not careful.
Yeah. And so that is where that tends to be our default. We're not spiritual beings, and spiritual in the way that Jesus is by default. We're physical. we have that carnal nature by default. Right? Well, that's where we kind of, we have to work at being the spiritual people of the church that we're to be. And so we have to, and I didn't mean to go on a long rant, but these two lessons kind of go into that one, the side of people wanting to be the greatest, and then looking at a lot of the physical, still focusing on that physical. And so I just want to make sure that we understand that and truly, because here's the thing, and Dad pointed to it earlier. We have, in a way, made the things we do kind of what makes us a Christian, right? The coming to church, the taking of communion, the baptism, the way we worship, those type of things. Now, those are important things. They're laid out for us in the Bible for a reason. But if you're just doing those things because you think that makes you a Christian, then your heart's not in the right place. Those things should be a byproduct of you being a Christian and having God in your heart. And the reason I say this is because I'm going to be honest with you, those things I've been talking about, those are, in the scheme of things, those are pretty easy. It can be sometimes hard to get up and come to church, but in the end, it's easy to go to church. It's easy to take communion. It's easy to sing, right? It's easy to be baptized. It's not hard to have someone come in there.
To go through the motions.
Right.
But if you're doing it with our heart, the Lord's Supper sometimes is very difficult
Yes.
for me because I realize how far I fall short.
Yeah.
And so when you do it right, it's a journey, and it can be a struggle.
He took the rest of my sentence away.
I'm not bad. I didn't mean to do that.
But if we're doing it, if we're 100% committed to that, but then just those things, then you look at what made Christians in the New Testament. It wasn't just those things. It was the going out and being willing to die. It was the going out and doing everything they could to try to convert people. Right? It was constantly spreading the message of Jesus. It was sacrificing their land and their wealth and their things for the church. It was, one of the things I was studying up on, and I think we've talked about this before, is that they would used to take babies, if they didn't want the baby, and they would just go throw it in the city dump. And guess what? The Christians were out there waiting, picking up the babies and taking them home and raising them. Right? They were going into disease-filled areas, knowing more than likely they were going to die, taking care of people. They were doing everything they could to spread the word about it. That is what a Christian was in the New Testament. Go ahead.
Service and love.
Service and love.
What it comes down to.
Yeah.
Because we believe in God, and He wants us to be, we're His servants, that we're slaves to God.
Yep.
That's what we are. It says in the Bible. You are servants to God.
And so,
So the motivating factor for the service.
yeah, love should be the greatest command. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, right? And love should be the ultimate starting point. That's where we start. And then we do all these things because we love Jesus and because we want to keep His commandments and follow Him the best way we can. All right, so I'm off my tangent there. I'm sorry. This next one, again, it speaks to the disciples, and it gets into that jealousy, kind of getting a little bit what I call the physical, emotional side here. I'm going to read Mark 9, 38 through 41. John said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw someone using your name to cast out demons, but we told him to stop because he wasn't in our group." "Don't stop him," Jesus said. "No one who performs a miracle in my name will soon be able to speak evil of me. Anyone who is not against us is for us. If anyone gives you even a cup of water because you belong to the Messiah, I tell you the truth, that person will surely be rewarded." So, it's interesting. The first note I put here is Jesus is not saying that being indifferent or neutral toward Him is good as being committed. Right? And we see that, in Matthew 12:30, He says, "Anyone who isn't with me opposes me, and anyone who is working against me, or isn't working with me is actually working against me." In both cases, Jesus pointed out the neutrality toward Him is not possible. Right? And so this isn't about, oh, well, people who are neutral are okay. He's making a point here. His followers, I think, is the point he's trying to make here, is not going to resemble each other or be all the same groups. They're going to look different from cultural aspects, from a lot of different things. People who are on Jesus' side have the same goal of building up the kingdom of God, and they should not let their differences interfere with this goal. Those who share a common faith in Christ should cooperate. People don't have to be just like us to follow Jesus with. I'm going to be honest with you, and I only have a few minutes here, but I think this is one of the things that has hurt the Church of Christ. We have, in a sense, kind of cut ourselves off from a lot of other organizations and a lot of other people because we have said, we've done it inside the Church of Christ. That church doesn't worship the way we like, so we're not going to have anything to do with them. Right? And so this is, and I don't have time to go into how I think this should be laid out, but I do think there's people who with common faith can work out differences. If you actually look at the beginning of Alexander Campbell and his movement, this is what he was trying to do. Work where there's similarities and work out the differences together. But ultimately it shattered. But we can look at that some other day. But here's the other thing too. The disciples here, I believe, were jealous. If you look, 9 of them, if we regard back, remember? 9 of them were not able to cast out a single spirit. If we look at Luke 9:40, but then they see a man who's not even one of their group is casting out demons in Jesus' name. Now you would think the disciples who've been with Jesus for several years would be able to do this, would have the faith to do this. But some man who's not even been with him is doing it. And so I think there was a jealousy there. How many times have you heard, that church over there is growing, they must be doing something wrong? There's a jealousy factor there, right?
They already want to be the greatest in the kingdom and sit on the right and left of Jesus. They don't need anybody else that's doing even better than them to come along and vie for that title as well. I think that may have been some of their consideration while they were there.
The note I put here is, our pride is hurt when someone else succeeds where we have failed. But Jesus says there is no room for such jealousy in the spiritual warfare of his kingdom. Share Jesus' open arms attitude towards Christians working outside your group. Rejoice when they are able to bring people to Christ. Now, we have understanding of some of our differences in actually bringing people to Christ. I'm not saying we just accept everything they teach on that stuff. But I think if you go back and read Alexander Campbell's writings, and a lot of the people who were part of that first movement, I think their intentions were right. Right? We need to figure out how we can work with other people who we may not 100% agree with. Right? Doesn't mean we take on their belief. Yeah, I mean, if you're just not having anything to do with people, well, you believe different from me, I'm sorry, we're going to cut you off. That's not going to work. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus had conversations and dealt with people all the time who were a polar opposite of what he was and what he believed. And so I think, again, there's a lot of little things in here that I believe are in here. Obviously, 100% believe everything's in the Bible for a reason. And I think these 3 lessons here, and then finally the one, go through the temptation on your own. Well, I think we know about temptation, right? We need to avoid it, and we have to resist it. And again, we need to be childlike in our nature around it. And not be stumbling blocks. But I want us to get to the point to where we understand, we truly understand what our roles are. And who we are to be as the church. All right, we're not to be just a bunch of people who meet up here every Sunday and Wednesday. We are to be a people who's changing our community and changing the world. And if you look at one of the biggest problems in the world right now and in the church right now is the church has stopped doing that. The church has stopped changing, for the most part. I'm not 100%. The churches that you see, they've stopped changing the world like we saw in the New Testament. We've stopped kind of changing our communities, being the shining light in our communities that everyone knew, And so that's my goal and my purpose. And And again, like I said, with everything I teach, it's I got a bunch of fingers pointing back at me, because this is something Chad needs to work on too. Go ahead.
What I think it boils down to is just a matter of fortitude. You know, when we get caught up in everything, with everything that's going on around us, like I said, in the physical, whether it's a job or whatever, raising kids, and it's just, seems like there's so little time left, but, and I know the scripture says, to seek ye first, and all this other will come along, and, but, when you've done something for so long,
It's hard.
It's just hard, and it is a work, but I think it just comes down to a matter of, want to, we pray, Lord, send me an opportunity that I might, and then that opportunity's there, but you gotta look for that opportunity.
You got it. And I think, Troy, the ultimate thing too is, what are we willing to sacrifice for God? What are we willing to sacrifice in our lives, in our comfortable American lives, for God? That to me, that's what it boils down to, because a lot of us are not willing to sacrifice those comforts we have in order to serve Jesus. And so, when do we finally get there? Does God have to do like he did with Jerusalem to get us there? Or Israel, I'm sorry? Or do we say, hey, I really don't want that to happen, let's take care of this? So, anyways, we're a few minutes over. Go through the warnings against temptations, and then we'll start next week in looking at the parable of the lost sheep. Thank you.